everyone, and welcome to my channel. I'm going to be reviewing today two non-fiction books, Empireland by Sathnam Sanghera and Natives by Akala, which I both rate very highly and which I thought were quite complementary, so I thought it would be interesting to put them together. I rated Empireland 4 stars and I rated Natives 5 stars. Really a must read, this one. So let's start with Empireland. Sathnam Sanghera is a British journalist who was born from Punjabi parents, and he's exploring in the book how the British Empire, who I think at its peak in 1920s actually covered 24% of Earth's land area, so it was, massive, has now impacted modern Britain. So he's discussing the history, what actually happened during the empire, and then links it to modern Britain. He covers, for example, the looting that took place during that time and the issue of repatriation of museum artifacts to other countries. That is a topic that is currently being discussed in the UK. He discusses also the anti-immigrant rhetoric that we are hearing in the UK today, which sort of ignores the fact that the reason people are coming to the UK is because the UK at some point colonized those countries and actually encouraged immigrants to come to the UK, in particular after the Second World War, to rebuild the economy and actually build also the NHS, which everyone in the UK is really proud of. To give you a sense of the amount covered in this book, I'm going to read you a short passage that basically provides quite a neat summary of all the things that have been impacted by the empire. Empire explains why we have a diaspora of millions of Britons spread around the world. Empire explains the global pretensions of our foreign and defense secretaries. Empire explains the feeling that we're exceptional and can go it alone when it comes to everything from Brexit to dealing with global pandemics. Empire helped to establish the position of the City of London as one of the world's major financial centers, and also ensures that the interest of finance trumped the interest of so many other groups in the 21st century. Empire explains how some of our richest families and institutions and cities became wealthy. Empire explains our particular brand of racism. It explains our distrust of cleverness, our propensity for jingoism. Let's face it, imperialism is not something that can be erased with a few statues being torn down or a few institutions facing up to their dark past. It exists as a legacy in my very being and, more widely, explains nothing less than who we are as a nation. Jingoism, by the way, is a word that I did not know, and the author kept on using it, so I had to look for it. It means extreme patriotism. It means the extreme patriotism, especially in the form of warlike and aggressive foreign policy. That gives you a sense of, the UK. Two things that I find quite interesting and enlightening in the books. The first one is that it covers how an empire mindset of Western superiority is actually still taught at schools today, which was a direct consequence of using education as a colonialist tool. And it also discusses how British people apparently have a phobia of cleverness that has been sort of institutionalized by the empire, because during that time it was more important to get people who were not too smart, who were reliable, who could be depended on, rather than people who were thinking for themselves maybe a bit too much. Another quick passage on that front that I really found interesting mentions, observing the British in India, Adolf Hitler expressed his admiration for the public school system that produced such, quote-unquote, men of inflexible will and ruthless energy who regard intellectual problems as a waste of time, but know human nature and how to dominate other men in the most unscrupulous fashion. Interesting that Hitler looked at the education system during the empire in that light. The second thing that I thought was really fascinating is what the author calls a collective amnesia about empire, with a lot of British people apparently having somewhat forgotten some of the details of what happened during the empire and having a sort of glamorized view of what it is. So some statistics that I'm just going to read out. A third of British people believe the empire and colonialism was great. Only 8% of British people have learned about British colonialization in Africa, and the percentage of people who have actually heard about the transatlantic slave trade is, barely higher than that, which I thought was just shocking. Based on the statistics, I think every British person ought to read this book and get, reacquainted with their history of empire. I personally learned a lot. Very quickly, I'm going to mention that the book is very, very well researched. There's a massive bibliography at the end, and it quotes also references throughout the book. So I have sort of confidence that what it's saying has been, is well founded. Finally, the writing style, it's pretty accessible. It's sort of written in a journalistic tone, but from time to time the author also switches to the first person narration so that he can, give a bit of a personal touch, talking, for example, about how before writing this book, he just did not know anything about the empire history and the link between the UK and India during that time, even though, his family was originally Indian. So that gave quite a nice touch. Overall, I think it was really interesting, and so I would recommend it. I think it works better for people who live in the UK than for people outside, but if you're interested in history and in society, please do give it a try. Now let's move on to Natives by Akala. If you've never heard Akala talk, do yourself a favor and actually, check on YouTube some of his talks. I'm gonna put two actually in the description. One is an interview about this book, which I found really interesting, and that actually led me to buying the book. And the second one is a talk that he gave at Oxford, I believe, about sort of global history and how that has been also shaped by an empire mindset in a way, how history has been revised according to certain people's rules. But generally, this is a must-read for anyone interested in race and equality. So first, starting with the writing style, which for me is the reason I rated this 5-star. It's so small, but it's also amazingly well written. It really feels like Akala is just talking to you. It's like having a chat with a really smart friend. He sometimes uses sarcasm quite heavily, and I just devoured the book because of that. It's part biography, and so Akala sort of provides an insight into how he grew up in the UK as a black person. He's technically mixed race because his mom is white, but as he explains in the book, race is a social construct, and so he is considered by most people as black, with all the issue that this creates for someone being black in the UK. Racism at school, being stopped and searched by the police when you're 12, those sort of things. So it was very often quite touching. For example, when he's 5, he sort of realizes that his mom is white, and he starts already thinking about the implication of this color difference. But obviously it's also very often quite depressing to know that this is what happens in our society. And then he uses this sort of biography to weave in this really interesting study of race and class. And he initially focuses a bit on the UK, but he really broadens that out to much broader themes around what blackness and whiteness is, around the relationship between the West and other countries. He covers Cuba, South Africa, America. So it's very much not only for British people or people living in the UK. He also discusses class to some extent, although it's very much focused on race. Class is sort of always present in the issue of race, especially in the UK, and so he weaves that super nicely. It's a sort of philosophical book, I would say. It really makes me think about Christopher Hitchens' essays. If you haven't read them, they're quite interesting. It definitely made me think about several sort of angles to this issue of race that I hadn't necessarily considered in depth before. So for example, I'm going to read a passage that's, relatively at the beginning, where he says, "As long as whiteness is a metaphor for power, blackness must of course function as a metaphor for powerlessness. And as long as money whitens, poverty must blacken. And that's the link as well between race and class. And the whole book sort of explores this in a lot of detail. And towards the end, one of the conclusions, it's not the only one, but one passage that I thought was really interesting is the key question therefore becomes this: what happens once money no longer whitens? When whiteness is no longer a metaphor for power? When whiteness is no longer default? When Chinese or Indian actors can be universal sex symbols in the way that Brad Pitt and George Clooney are thought to be? When the world's leading economies are decidedly in Asia? Whiteness will have to find a totally new meaning. This process is already well underway, and some of the problems we're seeing in the West discussed above are the pangs of people racialized as white getting used to this new world. It is one of the central arguments of this book that some of the major political currents in the Western world today must be understood through the racial reframing of the world, a reframing that has been taking place since 1945 and only looks like accelerating in the years to come. So it definitely gave me a lot of food for thought. It's really hard to summarize the book because of the magnitude of the argument and topics covered. It is really a must-read for everyone. I think the two books generally complemented well each other. This one looked at the UK history and how it influences today, and this one was more in-depth analysis of our society nowadays and broadening that outside of the UK as well. And there is a lot of discussion these days around systemic racism in the UK, and a lot of people, not only in the UK but elsewhere, in the US as well, seem to believe that the UK might not have as much of a problem with racism as we're seeing in the US, partly because obviously the UK is a lot less violent, but also because if you understand the history, the racism and the slavery that the UK had during its history was basically done offshore. And so that has had a massive impact on our society now. So I thought these two books were really important for everyone to read, to get that context, to really understand, the struggle that some people, ethnic minorities, are still facing nowadays. So yeah, if you're interested in this topic, by all means, please pick up both of them and let me know what you think. I hope this video was interesting. Please like and subscribe and leave a comment. I'd love to start the discussion on these two books as well. Bye bye!